At 8:55 in the morning on May 1st, 1960, a violent orange flash filled the cockpit of a single aircraft flying 13 miles above the Soviet Union. The pilot, a 30-year-old American named Francis Gary Powers, felt a tremendous thump from behind. His aircraft shuddered violently. The control column went slack in his hands. The instruments spun wildly, their needles swinging in random arcs. Warning lights blazed across the panel. The aircraft began to nose over, pitching forward into a dive. And in that instant, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War began to unravel. The black-painted airplane tumbling through the stratosphere had been considered untouchable. For 4 years, it had crossed into Soviet airspace again and again. It photographed military bases, nuclear facilities, and missile sites while Soviet fighters clawed desperately at the sky far below, unable to reach it. The aircraft flew at 70,000 feet, nearly 14 miles above the Earth, where the air is so thin that a human being would lose consciousness in seconds without protection. Soviet interceptors could barely reach 60,000 feet. The gap of 2 miles might as well have been 1,000, and yet on this spring morning, something had finally reached the untouchable airplane. The Lockheed U-2, America's most secret weapon in the intelligence war, had been struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The Cold War would never be the same again. The U-2 was not born from military brilliance. It was born from desperation and rejection. By 1952, American intelligence officials faced a terrifying reality. They knew almost nothing about what was happening inside the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain was more than a political boundary. It was an impenetrable wall of secrecy that blocked every attempt to peer inside. The best available photographs of Soviet territory came from German Luftwaffe reconnaissance missions flown during World War II. The images were more than a decade old. Soviet air defenses had grown so aggressive that American reconnaissance aircraft approaching the borders were being attacked and shot down. Several crews had already been killed. The families received telegrams expressing regret. The missions continued anyway. The Soviet Union was building nuclear weapons, developing long-range bombers, and possibly constructing intercontinental ballistic missiles. American military planners had no reliable way to know where these weapons were located, how many existed, or when they might be ready to strike. The intelligence gap was not merely an inconvenience. It threatened the survival of the nation. President Dwight Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. He had commanded the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He knew that intelligence could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. In 1953, an Air Force officer named John Seaberg at Wright Air Development Command drafted a formal requirement for a revolutionary aircraft. The project was designated MX-2147, code-named Bald Eagle. The specifications seemed impossible. The airplane would need to cruise at 70,000 feet, higher than any aircraft had ever operated for sustained periods. It would need a range of at least 1,500 nautical miles, and it would need to carry cameras capable of photographing military installations from the edge of space. No aircraft in existence came close to meeting these requirements. The technology simply did not exist. The Air Force invited 3 aircraft manufacturers to compete for the contract. Bell Aircraft proposed a twin-engine design called the X-16, projecting a ceiling of 69,500 feet. The Glenn L. Martin Company offered a modified version of the British Canberra bomber. Fairchild submitted its own design. Lockheed was not invited to compete. The company had no experience building this type of aircraft. The Air Force saw no reason to include them. Lockheed's legendary engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson, learned about the competition through a retired Air Force officer who had joined the company and heard rumors from his Pentagon contacts. Johnson was not the type of man to accept rejection. He had built the P-38 Lightning, the fastest fighter of World War II. He had Eisenhower U-2 Spyplane reached 70,000 feet, when MiGs could only hit 60,000. At 8:55 in the morning on May 1st, 1960, a violent orange flash filled the cockpit of a single aircraft flying 13 miles above the Soviet Union. The pilot, a 30-year-old American named Francis Gary Powers, felt a tremendous thump from behind. His aircraft shuddered violently. The control column went slack in his hands. The instruments spun wildly, their needles swinging in random arcs. Warning lights blazed across the panel. The aircraft began to nose over, pitching forward into a dive. And in that instant, one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Cold War began to unravel. The black-painted airplane tumbling through the stratosphere had been considered untouchable. For 4 years, it had crossed into Soviet airspace again and again. It photographed military bases, nuclear facilities, and missile sites while Soviet fighters clawed desperately at the sky far below, unable to reach it. The aircraft flew at 70,000 feet, nearly 14 miles above the Earth, where the air is so thin that a human being would lose consciousness in seconds without protection. Soviet interceptors could barely reach 60,000 feet. The gap of 2 miles might as well have been 1,000. And yet on this spring morning, something had finally reached the untouchable airplane. The Lockheed U-2, America's most secret weapon in the intelligence war, had been struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The Cold War would never be the same again. The U-2 was not born from military brilliance. It was born from desperation and rejection. By 1952, American intelligence officials faced a terrifying reality. They knew almost nothing about what was happening inside the Soviet Union. The Iron Curtain was more than a political boundary. It was an impenetrable wall of secrecy that blocked every attempt to peer inside. The best available photographs of Soviet territory came from German Luftwaffe reconnaissance missions flown during World War II. The images were more than a decade old. Soviet air defenses had grown so aggressive that American reconnaissance aircraft approaching the borders were being attacked and shot down. Several crews had already been killed. The families received telegrams expressing regret. The missions continued anyway. The Soviet Union was building nuclear weapons, developing long-range bombers, and possibly constructing intercontinental ballistic missiles. American military planners had no reliable way to know where these weapons were located, how many existed, or when they might be ready to strike. The intelligence gap was not merely an inconvenience. It threatened the survival of the nation. President Dwight Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. He had commanded the Allied forces in Europe during World War II. He knew that intelligence could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. In 1953, an Air Force officer named John Seaberg at Wright Air Development Command drafted a formal requirement for a revolutionary aircraft. The project was designated MX-2147, code-named Bald Eagle. The specifications seemed impossible. The airplane would need to cruise at 70,000 feet, higher than any aircraft had ever operated for sustained periods. It would need a range of at least 1,500 nautical miles, and it would need to carry cameras capable of photographing military installations from the edge of space. No aircraft in existence came close to meeting these requirements. The technology simply did not exist. The Air Force invited 3 aircraft manufacturers to compete for the contract. Bell Aircraft proposed a twin-engine design called the X-16, projecting a ceiling of 69,500 feet. The Glenn Martin Company offered a modified version of the British Canberra bomber. Fairchild submitted its own design. Lockheed was not invited to compete. The company had no experience building this type of aircraft. The Air Force saw no reason to include them. Lockheed's legendary engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson, learned about the competition through a retired Air Force officer who had joined the company and heard rumors from his Pentagon contacts. Johnson was not the type of man to accept rejection. He had built the P-38 Lightning, the fastest fighter of World War II. He had designed the F-80, America's first operational jet fighter. He was already working on the F-104 Starfighter, the first aircraft capable of sustained flight at twice the speed of sound. When Kelly Johnson decided to do something, obstacles were merely problems to be solved. He began sketching an entirely new concept on his own initiative. Kelly Johnson's design philosophy was radical. Every military aircraft in history had been built to survive combat, to carry weapons, to absorb damage and keep flying. Johnson threw all of that away. He proposed stripping an aircraft down to its absolute minimum weight, eliminating armor, weapons, and even conventional landing gear. He would graft enormous sailplane wings onto a modified fuselage, creating what amounted to a jet-powered glider. The wings would have an aspect ratio of more than 10:1, meaning the wingspan was 10 times greater than the average width of each wing. The wingspan stretched 80 feet and 2 inches from tip to tip. This configuration would generate tremendous lift in the thin air of the upper atmosphere. But there was a cost. The aircraft could withstand only 2.5 times the force of gravity before the wings would snap off. A conventional fighter could handle 9 times gravity. Johnson's creation would be incredibly fragile. The landing gear was equally unconventional. Instead of the traditional tricycle arrangement, Johnson designed a bicycle configuration with 2 main wheels arranged in a line down the center line of the fuselage. Small outrigger wheels called pogos hung from the wings during takeoff, then dropped away as the aircraft lifted into the air. When landing, the pilot would have to balance the aircraft on the 2 centerline wheels while the wings slowly tipped to one side. Titanium skid plates on the wingtips would protect them as they scraped along the runway. Johnson called his design the CL-282. He submitted it to the Air Force in March of 1954. 3 months later, the Air Force rejected it. The reasons were numerous. The aircraft had only 1 engine instead of the preferred 2. The design was unconventional. The landing gear was bizarre. The structural limits were too restrictive. General Curtis LeMay of Strategic Air Command was famously contemptuous. According to declassified records, LeMay stood up halfway through the briefing, removed the cigar from his mouth, and declared that if he wanted high-altitude photographs, he would put cameras in his B-36 bombers. The general then walked out of the room, dismissing the entire concept as a waste of his time. LeMay was focused on building the nuclear strike force that would destroy the Soviet Union in the event of war. He had no patience for what he saw as an impractical experiment. What saved Kelly Johnson's design was the intervention of civilian scientists who had the ear of the president himself. President Dwight Eisenhower had grown deeply concerned about the possibility of a Soviet surprise attack. The memory of Pearl Harbor remained fresh. Eisenhower wanted to ensure that America would never again be caught off guard. He convened a special panel of experts called the Technological Capabilities Panel, chaired by Dr. James Killian, Jr., the president of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. One member of the panel was Edwin Land, the founder of Polaroid Corporation. Land had invented instant photography and built it into a billion-dollar enterprise. He was a genius inventor and a brilliant persuader. When he learned about Johnson's rejected aircraft, he immediately recognized its potential. Here was a way to see behind the Iron Curtain without risking war. A single aircraft flying too high to intercept could photograph more in one mission than 100 spies could report in a year. On November 5, 1954, Land wrote a pivotal memorandum to Allen Dulles, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He argued that overflight of the Soviet Union was both urgent and presently feasible. He recommended that the program be handled by the CIA rather than the military, to avoid the bureaucratic entanglements of the Defense Department and the rivalries between the armed services. A civilian program could move faster, maintain tighter secrecy, and avoid the legal complications of uniformed military personnel flying over foreign territory. Land and Killian briefed President Eisenhower directly in the Oval Office. The president listened carefully. He understood the intelligence value immediately, but he also understood the risks. If a military aircraft were shot down over the Soviet Union with military personnel aboard, it would be an act of war. Eisenhower approved the program with one crucial condition. The operation must remain entirely civilian. The pilots would resign their military commissions and become employees of Lockheed. The aircraft would carry no weapons. If anything went wrong, the United States could plausibly deny any military involvement. On November 26, 1954, the day after Thanksgiving, Allen Dulles assigned a brilliant economist and covert operations specialist named Richard Bissell, Jr. to run the program. Bissell had helped administer the Marshall Plan that rebuilt Europe after World War II. He was brilliant, ruthless, and utterly dedicated to the mission. The project received the code name Aquatone. Lockheed signed a contract for 20 aircraft at a total cost of $22.5 million. The first payment, $1.26 million, was mailed directly to Kelly Johnson's home address to maintain secrecy. Johnson assembled a small team of approximately 50 engineers at Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Division, an organization that would later become famous as the Skunk Works. They began work immediately. The first aircraft parts were fabricated in January of 1955. Johnson promised to deliver the first aircraft in just 8 months. Everyone thought he was being optimistic. Johnson needed a test site, completely hidden from public view. The aircraft had to fly without anyone knowing it existed. In April of 1955, he flew over the Nevada desert with Bissell and a test pilot named Tony LaVia. They spotted a dry lake bed on the edge of the Atomic Energy Commission's nuclear test site. The location was perfect. It was already a restricted area. No civilians could approach without authorization. The flat, dry lake bed provided a natural runway. Johnson recalled that within 30 seconds of seeing it, he knew they had found the place. The site appeared on government maps as Area 51. Johnson named it Paradise Ranch, later admitting this was a deliberate exaggeration to help recruit workers to the remote location. The name stuck. On August 1st, 1955, Tony LaVia was conducting high-speed taxi tests in the first completed U-2 when the enormous wings generated so much lift that the aircraft rose into the air at just 70 knots. LaVia had not intended to take off. The aircraft simply refused to stay on the ground. He managed to get it back down, though the landing destroyed the tires and started a brake fire. Johnson's design worked even better than expected, perhaps too well. The first planned test flight came 3 days later on August 4th. LaVia, using the radio call sign Angel 1, climbed to 8,000 feet. He discovered immediately that landing the U-2 was extraordinarily difficult. The massive wings generated such powerful lift that the aircraft simply refused to settle onto the runway. It wanted to keep flying. LaVia made several passes, each time floating above the concrete as if held by invisible hands. Pilots later compared the experience to trying to land a potato chip. The problem would persist throughout the aircraft's operational life. Every landing required a chase car racing down the runway, with another pilot calling out altitude in feet and inches until the wheels finally touched. The engineering challenges of sustained flight at 70,000 feet were unlike anything aviation had encountered before. At that altitude, atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 5% of sea level. The air is so thin that conventional aircraft simply cannot generate enough lift to stay aloft. The difference between the speed at which the aircraft would stall from flying too slowly and the speed at which shock waves would destroy the wings from flying too fast narrowed to as little as 10 knots. Pilots called this deadly convergence the coffin corner. The margin for error was essentially zero. Fly 10 knots too slow and the wings would stall. Fly 10 knots too fast and the shock waves would tear them apart. The original engine, a Pratt & Whitney J57P37A, produced more than 10,000 pounds of thrust at sea level. But in the thin air of the upper atmosphere, fuel consumption dropped to approximately 700 pounds per hour while the engine struggled to produce adequate thrust. Engine flameouts were common, sometimes occurring 6 times during a single mission. The engine would simply stop, starved of air. Early versions required pilots to descend to 35,000 feet, well within range of enemy fighters, to restart the engine. Engineers worked frantically to develop a modified engine that could relight at altitude. Standard aviation fuel boiled away at extreme altitude like water on a hot stove. The low atmospheric pressure caused the fuel to vaporize in the tanks, creating air pockets that could starve the engine. General Jimmy Doolittle, the legendary pilot who had led the first bombing raid on Tokyo and was now serving as a board member of Shell Oil Company, persuaded the company to develop a special low-volatility fuel for the program. The initial batches required feedstocks normally used for Shell's flit insecticide production, causing a nationwide shortage of bug spray in 1955. The fuel, eventually designated JPTS, cost significantly more than standard jet fuel and was produced at only 2 refineries in the United States. Above 62,000 feet, a boundary known as the Armstrong Line, atmospheric pressure drops so low that water boils at human body temperature. The human body contains a great deal of water in the blood, in the tissues, in every cell. At 70,000 feet, a pilot without protection would experience explosive decompression. The fluids in the body would begin to boil. Consciousness would be lost in 8 to 10 seconds. Death would follow within 15 seconds. The lungs would rupture. The blood would literally bubble in the veins. It was a horrifying way to die, and every U-2 pilot knew exactly what awaited them if their pressure suit failed. The David Clark Company of Worcester, Massachusetts developed a revolutionary partial pressure suit, specifically for the U-2 program. Unlike a full pressure suit that creates a complete sealed environment like a spacecraft, The partial pressure suit worked by clamping tightly against the body with inflatable bladders if the cockpit lost pressure. The suit squeezed the pilot's body hard enough to prevent the blood from boiling. It was uncomfortable, restrictive, and exhausting to wear for hours at a time. Pilots lost approximately 5% of their body weight during missions lasting up to 8 hours from the combination of stress, dehydration, and physical exertion. They ate pureed food through tubes because the helmet could not be removed. They breathed pure oxygen for 1 full hour before every flight to purge nitrogen from their blood and prevent decompression sickness, the same condition that afflicts deep-sea divers who surface too quickly. The cameras that the U-2 carried were as revolutionary as the aircraft itself. Edwin Land championed the development, while Dr. James Baker of Harvard designed the optics. The primary system was the Hicon Model 73B, featuring a 36-inch focal-length lens that could resolve features as small as 2.5 feet from 13 miles above the Earth. From that altitude, analysts could pick out a basketball on a playground. They could read the identification numbers painted on aircraft wings. They could count the individual missiles standing on their launch pads. The camera rotated through 7 glass windows in the belly of the aircraft, photographing a strip of territory up to 125 miles wide. Each mission could produce up to 4,000 stereoscopic photo pairs. A single mission's film, when printed at full size, could cover a strip equivalent to the entire Baltimore to Washington highway. From the edge of space, American intelligence could read the numbers painted on Soviet aircraft, count the missiles on launch pads, and identify the types of vehicles in military convoys. On July 4, 1956, an American pilot named Hervey Stockman departed Wiesbaden, West Germany, and flew directly into Soviet airspace. His mission, designated 2013, crossed Poland into Belarusia, then continued north to Leningrad. He photographed naval shipyards at the heart of Soviet submarine construction, the facilities building the nuclear-powered submarines that would soon threaten American cities. The flight lasted 8 hours and 45 minutes. With more than 2.5 hours spent over Soviet territory at approximately 66,000 feet, Soviet radar tracked the U-2 from the moment it crossed the border. Interceptors scrambled immediately. MiG-17 and MiG-19 fighters made more than 20 attempts to reach the American aircraft. None could get close. The MiG-17 had a service ceiling of approximately 54,500 feet. The MiG-19 could reach perhaps 57,400 feet in a sustained climb. Even specially modified versions with armor and weapons removed could barely touch 60,000 feet. The American aircraft cruised effortlessly at 70,000, nearly 2 miles higher. Stockman watched them struggling far below, their contrails tracing desperate climbing arcs that fell short by thousands of feet. They looked like fish trying to catch a bird. At that very moment, Premier Nikita Khrushchev was attending a July 4th reception at the American Embassy in Moscow. He was toasting President Eisenhower's health, smiling for photographs, speaking of peaceful coexistence between the superpowers. He had no idea that an American spy plane was photographing Soviet military installations at that very moment. The diplomatic niceties continued while the intelligence war raged overhead. The next day, another pilot named Carmine Vito flew directly over Moscow itself, the only U-2 mission ever to pass above the Soviet capital. He photographed bomber factories, missile plants, and surface-to-air missile sites under construction. Vito later recalled that he tuned his radio to a Soviet station and listened to Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf as he flew over the Kremlin. It seemed appropriate somehow. The Wolf never caught Peter. The intelligence gathered by the U-2 transformed American understanding of Soviet military capabilities. For years, American officials had feared a bomber gap. They believed the Soviet Union possessed hundreds of long-range bombers capable of striking the United States with nuclear weapons. This fear had been fueled by a 1955 Soviet air show, where 10 Myasishchev M4 Bison bombers flew past the reviewing stand, circled around behind the trees, and flew past again to simulate a much larger force. American intelligence officers watching from the ground counted what appeared to be dozens of heavy bombers. The Strategic Air Command demanded massive increases in the American bomber force to counter the threat. Within weeks of the first U-2 missions, American intelligence confirmed that the entire Soviet Bison bomber fleet numbered approximately 30 aircraft. virtually the entire operational force. This was a fraction of what military planners had feared. The bomber gap was a myth, a carefully orchestrated Soviet deception that had nearly triggered an unnecessary arms race. Even more significant was the intelligence gathered about Soviet missiles. Khrushchev had boasted publicly that the Soviet Union was producing intercontinental ballistic missiles like sausages. American political leaders, including Senator John Kennedy, warned of a dangerous missile gap that threatened American security. Kennedy made the missile gap a central issue in his 1960 presidential campaign, accusing the Eisenhower administration of allowing Soviet superiority. The U-2 revealed the truth. On August 5, 1957, a pilot named Eugene Buster Edens was flying along the Moscow to Tashkent railway line when he spotted something unusual in the desert of Kazakhstan. It was the Baikonur Cosmodrome, the Soviet space and missile launch facility that American intelligence had not even known existed. Subsequent missions revealed that the Soviet Union possessed only 4 operational intercontinental ballistic missiles. The first-generation R-7 rockets were so large and cumbersome they could only be moved by rail. They required liquid propellant that degraded rapidly and took nearly 20 hours to fuel before launch. Far from raining missiles on American cities, the Soviets could barely maintain a token force. The missile gap was also a myth. Director of Central Intelligence George Tenet stated in 1998 that the U-2 data allowed President Eisenhower to confidently resist fierce domestic pressure for a massive arms build-up. Eisenhower knew with certainty that America had no bomber gap and no missile gap with the Soviet Union. The intelligence may have prevented an unnecessary nuclear arms race built on phantom threats, potentially saving hundreds of billions of dollars and avoiding the construction of thousands of nuclear weapons that would never have been needed. Approximately 24 deep penetration missions flew over the Soviet Union between 1956 and 1960. Hundreds of additional sorties covered peripheral areas and other nations of interest, including China, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. By 1960, the U-2 had photographed roughly 15% of Soviet territory, producing nearly 5,500 intelligence reports. These reports shaped American defense policy for a generation. President Eisenhower personally approved or disapproved every single mission over the Soviet Union. No overflight occurred without his explicit authorization. He sometimes took out a pencil and altered flight paths himself to avoid areas he considered too dangerous or too politically sensitive. He understood the risks better than anyone. A single mistake could trigger a war that would kill millions. The Soviet Union tracked every mission. Their radars were sophisticated enough to follow the U-2 from border to border. Soviet ground controllers watched in frustration as the American aircraft crossed thousands of miles of their territory with impunity. But tracking an aircraft and destroying it are very different things. The MiG-17 could reach approximately 54,000 feet. The MiG-19 stretched to 60,000 feet in specially modified variants with armor and weapons removed. The early MiG-21 achieved approximately 62,300 feet. The Sukhoi Su-9, the Soviets' best hope, could briefly touch 65,600 feet at its combat ceiling. None could sustain flight at an altitude where they could engage an aircraft cruising at 70,000 feet. At extreme altitude, jet engines simply could not produce enough thrust in the thin air. Soviet pilots practiced desperate zoom climbs, diving to build speed and then pulling into ballistic arcs upward, hoping to fire their cannons in the brief moment before gravity pulled them back down. But the physics were against them. By the time they reached their maximum altitude, they were moving too slowly to control their aircraft and could barely aim. Premier Khrushchev was furious. His son Sergei later described how Kremlin leaders berated the commander of Soviet air defense forces during one overflight. They demanded to know why the country that claimed technological superiority could not shoot down a single subsonic aircraft. Marshal Sergei Biryuzov, the air defense commander, reportedly replied that if he could become a missile himself, he would fly up and destroy the intruder personally. It was a statement of frustration and humiliation. The weapon that finally closed the altitude gap was the S-75 surface-to-air missile system, known to Western intelligence as the SA-2 guideline. Developed by the Soviet designer Pyotr Grushin beginning in 1953, the missile entered operational service in November of 1957. It could reach altitudes exceeding 80,000 feet while traveling at speeds greater than Mach 3, more than 3 times the speed of sound. Khrushchev had summoned his top aircraft designers and demanded solutions. The interceptor designers said they needed 3 to 4 years to develop an aircraft capable of reaching U-2 altitudes. The missile was faster. In October of 1959, an SA-2 destroyed a Taiwanese RB-57D reconnaissance aircraft over China at 66,000 feet. The age of untouchable flight was ending. Francis Gary Powers had joined the U-2 program in the summer of 1956. He was born in Jenkins, Kentucky, in the heart of Appalachian coal country, the son of a coal miner who worked deep underground. Powers escaped the mines by joining the Air Force in 1950 and earned his wings as a fighter pilot. He flew F-84 Thunderjets in Europe during the early 1950s, patrolling the borders that divided the free world from the communist bloc. The original 6 pilots selected for the U-2 program were Hervey Stockman, Carmine Vito, Carl Overstreet, Jake Kratt, Glendon Dunaway, and Martin Knutson. They were chosen from hundreds of candidates. Powers was selected because he held a Reserve Air Force commission, had extensive flying experience, demonstrated exceptional judgment under pressure, and passed every psychological and physical examination. Like all CIA pilots, he underwent a process called sheep dipping. He officially resigned his military commission and became a civilian employee of Lockheed conducting high-altitude weather research. His cover story explained his frequent trips to remote locations. His neighbors believed he worked on atmospheric sampling. The real training took place at Area 51 in the Nevada desert, far from curious eyes. No 2-seat U-2 trainer existed. The cockpit was too small and the aircraft too delicate for a second seat. New pilots received extensive ground instruction, practiced landings in conventional aircraft, while experienced pilots talked them through the procedures, then flew the U-2 solo with guidance from the ground on their very first flight. There was no other way. By May of 1960, Powers had completed 27 operational missions without incident. He was one of the most experienced U-2 pilots in the world. The mission on May 1, 1960, was designated Operation Grand Slam. It would be the first attempt to fly completely across the Soviet Union, entering from Pakistan in the south and exiting over Norway in the north. The route covered nearly 3,000 miles of Soviet airspace. The targets included the intercontinental ballistic missile launch facilities at Baikonur, the plutonium production facility at Chelyabinsk, and missile installations near Sverdlovsk. Powers would depart from Peshawar, Pakistan, and land at Bodo, Norway approximately 8 hours later. The mission had been delayed 3 times because of weather. President Eisenhower was scheduled to meet Premier Khrushchev at a summit in Paris in just 2 weeks. He wanted one final intelligence update before the negotiations began. Powers was certain the mission would be scrubbed again when the order came to proceed. His commanding officer asked if he wanted to carry the poison needle, a small device containing saxitoxin, a lethal shellfish toxin hidden inside a modified silver dollar. The needle was optional. No pilot was required to carry it. Powers usually declined. Something made him say yes that morning. He slipped the silver dollar into his pocket. Powers took off at 6:20 in the morning local time, climbing toward the stratosphere in the darkness before dawn. The mission proceeded normally for the first several hours. He crossed into Soviet territory and began photographing the targets as planned. Shortly before reaching the target area near Chelyabinsk, his autopilot malfunctioned. The aircraft began to pitch and yaw unpredictably. Powers switched to manual control. He could have turned back. The malfunction gave him a legitimate reason to abort. Instead, he continued, he was a professional. He had a job to do. At approximately 8:55 Moscow time, near the town of Kosulino in Sverdlovsk Oblast, roughly 1,300 miles inside the Soviet border, Powers felt a violent thump and saw an orange flash behind his aircraft. An A-2 missile had detonated near his aircraft, close enough to destroy the right stabilizer and send fragments tearing through the fragile airframe. The missile did not score a direct hit. It did not need to. The SA-2 carried a proximity fuse that detonated the warhead when it sensed a nearby target. The explosion sent shrapnel in all directions. The fragile aircraft, built to withstand only 2.5 times the force of gravity, began breaking apart immediately. The number of missiles fired remains disputed. Some accounts cite 8 missiles launched from 4 different batteries. Others report as many as 14. The confusion stemmed from catastrophic coordination failures between Soviet air defense commands. The missile operators and fighter controllers occupied separate floors at district headquarters and communicated poorly. The district commander was away on a training course. Nobody was clearly in charge. Powers could not eject safely. The U-2's ejection system was primitive by modern standards. The centrifugal forces in the spinning aircraft would have pushed his legs outward into the cockpit structure, severing them. He released the canopy, unbuckled his harness, and was immediately thrown halfway out of the aircraft. He was held only by his oxygen hose. The rushing air tore at his body. He had opened the safety covers on the destruct switches, but the forces pinning him in place meant he could no longer reach them. The destruct charge was only 2.5 pounds of explosive, designed to destroy the camera equipment and film, not the entire aircraft. His oxygen hose finally broke, and he tumbled free into the thin air of the stratosphere. He fell for tens of thousands of feet, waiting to reach thicker air before opening his parachute. He did not want Soviet radar to track his descent. He parachuted from approximately 34,000 feet, drifting down through the spring morning. He landed in a ploughed field near a collective farm. Soviet civilians surrounded him within minutes. The shoot-down killed more than one aircraft. A Soviet pilot named Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov was flying a MiG-19 when an SA-2 missile from an adjacent battery destroyed his aircraft. The missile operators did not know friendly fighters were in the area. The identification friend or foe codes had not been updated for the May Day holiday. Nobody had informed the missile batteries that Soviet interceptors were airborne. Safronov was hit 30 minutes after Powers had already reached the ground. Falling debris from the U-2 continued to appear on radar, convincing controllers that the target was still airborne. Safronov ejected, but died from his injuries. His death remained secret for approximately 30 years. His widow eventually married his flight leader, the only Soviet pilot in the engagement who survived. On May 5th, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet and announced that a spy plane had been shot down over the Soviet Union. He deliberately withheld the fact that the pilot had survived. He set a trap and waited for the Americans to walk into it. The Eisenhower administration activated its prepared cover story. A weather research aircraft had strayed off course over Turkey after the pilot experienced oxygen difficulties. The National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, the civilian predecessor to NASA, issued a detailed false press release. A U-2 at Edwards Air Force Base was painted with fictitious weather research markings and displayed to reporters. State Department officials assured the world that the United States did not violate Soviet airspace. On May 7th, Khrushchev sprung his trap. He revealed that the pilot was alive, unharmed, and in Soviet custody. He produced photographs of Powers, recovered U-2 equipment, surveillance images of Soviet military bases found in the wreckage, and detailed confessions. The American cover story collapsed immediately. The government issued increasingly desperate statements that contradicted each other. On May 11th, President Eisenhower made an unprecedented admission. No American president had ever publicly acknowledged authorizing espionage operations against another nation. Eisenhower took personal responsibility. He admitted that he had authorized the flights. He defended them as necessary for national security. Privately, Eisenhower told his secretary that he would like to resign. He later reflected that while everyone expected the program to eventually fail, the fact that it had been such a disaster and caught the nation so unprepared was rather painful. The four-power Paris summit convened on May 15th with Eisenhower, Khrushchev, French President Charles de Gaulle, and British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. The leaders had gathered to discuss Berlin, nuclear testing, and the possibility of reducing Cold War tensions. Khrushchev arrived furious, determined to extract maximum political advantage from the American humiliation. The summit collapsed the next day, before substantive discussions even began. Khrushchev demanded a formal American apology, condemnation of espionage as a crime against peace, punishment of those responsible, and a solemn pledge to end all reconnaissance flights forever. Eisenhower refused to apologize. He defended the flights as unfortunate but necessary given Soviet secrecy. He announced that future overflights would be suspended, but he would not condemn his own actions. Khrushchev withdrew his invitation for Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union. He stormed out of the conference. The diplomatic momentum that had been building since a promising summit at Camp David in September of 1959 vanished overnight. Eisenhower's hopes of ending his presidency with a historic peace agreement lay in ruins. The Cold War would continue for 3 more decades. Powers was tried before the military division of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union in Moscow in August of 1960. The trial lasted 3 days, from August 17th to 19th. He pleaded guilty to espionage and was sentenced to 10 years of confinement, 3 in prison and 7 in a labor camp. He endured extensive interrogation at Lubyanka prison, the notorious headquarters of the KGB. He was subjected to psychological pressure, trickery, and threats. Declassified CIA. Documents later confirmed that Powers followed his pre-mission orders exactly. He gave out no secret information. He revealed nothing that the Soviets did not already know from the wreckage. The agency concluded that he had performed as well as any pilot could have under the circumstances. On February 10, 1962, after 21 months of captivity, Powers was exchanged for convicted Soviet spy Rudolf Abel on the Glienicke Bridge, connecting West Berlin with Potsdam in East Germany. The negotiation had been conducted by James Donovan, an insurance lawyer who had defended Abel at trial and argued against executing him because he might prove useful in a future prisoner exchange. Donovan's foresight had made the exchange possible. As they parted, Abel said simply, "Goodbye, Jim." Donovan replied, "Good luck, Rudolph." Powers and Abel passed each other on the bridge without speaking. It was a cold morning. Neither man looked back. Powers returned home to public suspicion rather than gratitude. Many Americans questioned why he had not used the poison needle or destroyed his aircraft more thoroughly. A teacher told his daughter that her father should have killed himself rather than be captured. The Air Force refused to honor its guarantee of reinstating him with no loss in rank. The welcome home he expected never materialized. He worked as a U-2 test pilot for Lockheed from 1962 to 1970. He was then fired after publishing a memoir called Operation Overflight that upset officials at CIA headquarters by revealing details they preferred to keep secret. He struggled to find work. The man who had risked his life for his country found himself unemployable in the defense industry. He eventually found work as a helicopter traffic reporter, first for radio stations and then for KNBC television in Los Angeles. On August 1, 1977, Powers was killed at age 47 when his helicopter ran out of fuel over the Sepulveda Dam recreation area in Encino, California. Evidence suggests he maneuvered to avoid teenagers playing baseball below, sacrificing his chance at a safe emergency landing to protect children who never knew he was there. His last radio transmission was simply, "TV4 just lost." He crashed into a field adjacent to the baseball diamond. Francis Gary Powers is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among the heroes of every American war. Rehabilitation came decades too late for him to see it. The CIA had quietly awarded Powers its Intelligence Star for valor in 1965 while he was still alive, but the award remained classified. Posthumous recognition followed over the years. The Distinguished Flying Cross came in 1986. The Prisoner of War Medal came in 2000. The Silver Star came in 2012, presented by the Air Force Chief of Staff to Powers' grandchildren at the Pentagon. The general stated that at the height of the Cold War, the nation called on extraordinary men like Captain Powers to undertake the most sensitive and dangerous missions. Former CIA Director Allen Dulles had said in 1964 that Powers performed his duty in a very dangerous mission and performed it well. Dulles added that he knew more about that than some of Powers' detractors and critics. The U-2 revealed something fundamental about the nature of intelligence, security, and the risks nations take to protect themselves. A handful of civilian scientists, Edwin Land and James Killian, chief among them, overruled military generals who had dismissed the concept as worthless. 50 engineers working in a converted hangar in the California desert built an aircraft that changed the course of the Cold War in less than a year. The intelligence they gathered prevented an arms race built on imaginary threats, potentially saving hundreds of billions of dollars and avoiding a nuclear buildup that might have made catastrophe inevitable. Yet, the same program that brought such clarity also caused a diplomatic catastrophe. Years of careful negotiation between the superpowers were derailed in a single weekend. The trust that Eisenhower and Khrushchev had built evaporated instantly. The Cold War continued for 3 more decades. The pilots who flew these missions operated at the edge of human endurance. They wore primitive pressure suits in unpressurized cockpits. They flew aircraft that would kill them instantly if they moved 10 knots too slow or 10 knots too fast. Some died in training accidents, others endured capture and imprisonment. All served in silence, forbidden to speak of their accomplishments even to their families. The U-2 remains in active service today, more than 70 years after its first flight. Modern versions, designated U-2S, carry updated sensors, synthetic aperture radar, signals intelligence equipment, and newer General Electric F118 engines that produce far more thrust than the original J-57. The cockpit has been modernized with digital displays and improved life support systems. Yet the basic design, Kelly Johnson's elegant sailplane with a jet engine, remains recognizable to anyone who saw the original aircraft in 1955. No other aircraft in history has served continuously for so long. The pilots who fly it still wear full pressure suits that resemble astronaut gear. They still require chase cars driven by fellow pilots to guide them during landing, calling out altitude in feet as the wings refuse to settle. The aircraft that was built to fly higher than Soviet fighters could reach continues to operate above the altitude where most modern aircraft can function. Satellites have supplemented, but never replaced it. When clouds obscure satellite imagery or when intelligence needs demand persistent coverage of a specific location, the U-2 goes up, a human pilot making real-time decisions, able to adjust course and linger over targets of interest, remains invaluable in ways that orbiting spacecraft cannot match. It stands as a monument to the engineering genius of Kelly Johnson, the scientific vision of Edwin Land and James Killian, and the courage of the men who flew where no one had flown before. Powers himself captured the essential paradox of the U-2 pilot's existence. There was only one thing wrong with flying higher than any other man had ever flown. You could not brag about it. The secrecy that protected the program also denied its pilots any public recognition for their achievements. They flew alone, unarmed, into hostile territory, knowing that their government would deny any knowledge of their existence if they were captured or killed. They did this not for glory or medals, but because their country needed to know what was happening beyond the Iron Curtain. The intelligence they gathered helped prevent nuclear war by revealing that the threats American leaders feared most were largely illusions. The bomber gap did not exist. The missile gap did not exist. What did exist was the courage of men willing to fly into the unknown at the edge of space. They trusted their lives to an aircraft built by 50 engineers in a converted hangar. They were powered by an engine that might flame out at any moment. They were protected only by a pressure suit that could fail without warning. Their story deserves to be remembered not as a tale of failure when one aircraft finally fell, but as a testament to what a small group of determined people can accomplish when the stakes are nothing less than the survival of nations.